In a world so permanently uncertain, is it at all surprising that we are obsessed with predicting the future? An entire industry online has formed around astrology and horoscopes, and almost every city in the US has at least one psychic parlor where you can pay some lady named Janine to tell you about how you're about to lose your job because of a crystal, or something like that. Other people divine using past trends, the stock market, polls. Hell, there are even people who make millions of dollars making predictions for US politicians. We saw quite a bit of that last year as we approached the US election, when dozens of experts made bank trying to convince people that they knew exactly what would happen on election night. Some of these guys were dubbed modern-day Nostradamuses because they were usually right about US politics in the past, only to get it embarrassingly wrong this time when their predictions that Kamala Harris would win were not correct. There was even a Nostradamus AI system that made its own predictions. Go watch my last video on AI to see exactly how bizarre that concept is. Nostradamus, Nostradamus, Nostradamus. You've definitely heard this name somewhere before, at least once. Maybe the History Channel, maybe on like a weird conservative radio program or a YouTube video, but most people know Nostradamus as a nebulous ancient historical figure who wrote a number of shocking prophecies, and over the last several centuries, it's been claimed that, one by one, all of his prophecies have come true. If you lightly Google the guy, you'll see people breathlessly claiming that Nostradamus predicted the rise of Hitler, the space race, 9/11, and the antics of Donald Trump. It ends up sounding a lot like those claims that The Simpsons has predicted the future in all of its episodes. Turns out, it's actually kind of an identical situation. So, who really was Nostradamus? And are his prophecies actually coming true? Come learn with me. But first, this month's channel charity. Not really a charity per se, but the Gerber Hart LGBTQ+ Library and Archives here in Chicago is an organization that is very close to my heart. At a time when LGBT resources in history are under threat of erasure or blacklisting, it's doubly vital to support the people keeping that history alive and protected. The Gerber Hart Library has spent the last 4 decades preserving the queer history of Chicago and the Midwest with a free lending library and an archive of rare and vital historical materials, not to mention the outreach and events that they do, largely run by volunteers, and the work that they do is priceless. I've made a donation myself, and I implore you to do the same, or donate to the LGBTQ Library and Archive in your own community if there is one. Let's work together right now to protect vulnerable history in the face of authoritarian erasure. Now, before we get into it, a word from today's sponsor, June's Journey. I've talked about June's Journey many times on my channel because it's one of the few games that has really engaged me for a super long time. And if you love I Spy style hidden object games, murder mysteries, decoration games, and super well-researched 1920s historical flair, this game is definitely right up your alley. June's Journey follows the story of June Parker, who is investigating the murder of her sister and her brother-in-law, which takes her on adventures around the world and reveals family secrets. Is June a licensed detective? No, but she's got moxie and spunk, and that's really all you need, right? The game really has absolutely no dull moments, with dozens and dozens of new levels unlocking new chapters of the plot and side quests along this ever-changing mystery that you help solve by finding clues and other objects in the beautifully rendered scenes, and also completing puzzles. Like this one, where June starts noticing connections between mob violence and what she's investigating, and then June's brother-in-law Harry, who was a bootlegger, is revealed to have met with a guy named Eddie, and a bullet is found in his belongings. So now we have to find more clues. Come to find out, Eddie was a mob enforcer. Was he the killer? I guess we need to keep investigating. And just look at the new trailer. It really captures how exciting the plot is and how June gets into all sorts of shenanigans. You can download June's Journey for free by clicking the link below or scanning this QR code. It's available to play on iOS, Android, and PC. Thank you to June's Journey for sponsoring this video, and now let's get back to learning about Nostradamus. So if you watched my video about alchemy, where I discussed Nicholas Flamel, or my videos on Julie d'Aubigny or Triboulet, etc., you'll know that the story of Nostradamus is no different from any of those, because It's a fairly typical conundrum. A historical figure who was, sure, remarkable in some way, dies without a whole lot of recorded biographical info from their time. Over the following years and centuries, random writers pick up their story and elaborate on it in apocryphal ways, or they uncritically run with rumors. The historical figure then evolves into a larger-than-life legend whose myth fully exceeds the reality of what little we know about their life. Nicolas Flamel was a random French guy who we now remember as the mystical alchemist who became immortal. He wasn't. Julie d'Aubigny was a random French woman who we now know as the crazy badass sword fighter who burned down a convent to run off with her nun girlfriend. She didn't. Triboulet was a random French court jester who we now know as the snarky fool who smacked the king's ass and said he mistook him for the queen. He didn't. And Nostradamus, shockingly, was a random French guy who we now know as a magical writer of true prophecies. And, spoiler alert, it's way more complicated than that, so let's go back to the beginning. Like most historical figures of this era, we actually don't know a whole lot for certain about Nostradamus' life. We have a few contemporary sources, like his will, a few writings by people who knew him, letters, and accounts written by his son. Everything else is a thick fog of legend and rumor that we have to sort of interpret our way through, using educated guesses. Before he was Nostradamus, he was known as Michel de Nostradam. Born in Saint-Rémy-de-Provence, France in 1503, Nostradam came from a family of Jewish descent who had converted to Christianity a generation prior. The family was well-to-do and had a well-established tradition of doctors and merchants and well-educated men. The name Nostradam, a very heavy-handed Christian name, was taken by Michel's grandfather, Pierre, when he converted. It's not surprising why Pierre chose to depart from his Jewish heritage. At the time, France required Jews to convert or be forced to leave certain areas, and those who didn't had to wear Jewish identification. To make matters worse, the Jewish community were usually scapegoated whenever an epidemic broke out. Even though they converted to Christianity, life was still difficult, so Pierre and his wife Blanche moved to Provence, and their son Jaume got married there and had 9 children. The 5th child, Michel, was the one destined to become our famous prophet. Young Michel instantly became interested in medicine and set off for Avignon to further his studies, and it was here that he became a true Renaissance polymath and humanist. He studied anything he could and then transferred to the University of Montpellier, where he began to develop an apothecarial practice and eventually graduated with a medical degree. He struggled to find footing in any particular social sphere from the very beginning. On one hand, he was not afraid to critique his professors and speak his mind, and he abhorred anti-intellectualism. He intended to study everything he possibly could to understand all facets of life, and in an era where the trust in physicians was only beginning to become commonplace, he found himself spending years traveling and immersing himself in a wide variety of communities. This both benefited him and put him directly at odds with many of his contemporaries and superiors. He spent 10 years as a traveling physician, befriending unique thinkers he could relate to, or at least debate with. And as far as hands-on learning as a doctor goes, Nostradamus was tested in the most strenuous way. The plague was a horrible danger during most of his life, especially in Provence. Now, I do want to clarify here that the people in medieval and Renaissance France did bathe. However, especially moving into the 16th century and the Enlightenment era, it was increasingly believed that water could make you ill through your pores, and so many people would still use soap and bathe occasionally, but more often they would do what's called a dry bath, where you basically scrub yourself down with a rough cloth and possibly a cleaning powder. Still, this was not really good enough in plague years, and the prevalence of lice, open cesspools, and rampant vermin made disease control extremely difficult. Ironically, people often blamed the Jewish population for the plague. Meanwhile, Jews were required by cultural law to bathe and keep clean, so they tended to catch the plague a lot less. Just all in all, a mess of a situation. In such a terror-filled time, people looked to anything they could for answers and guidance. Nostradamus, as a traveling doctor witnessing the worst of this carnage and suffering, was not really any different. As he watched children be abandoned, mass suicide, and hordes of bodies abounding, he began to theorize that plague must not only be a divine punishment for man's evils, but also the result of astrological movements. And so, he treated the plague by treating the plague of the soul. He instructed his patients to repent for their wickedness and also improve their lives and habits. Stay active, sleep well, eat healthily, be a mensch. And he also devised a protective powder made of various herbs and flowers. We will never really know how effective his treatments actually were, but his patients seemed to view him as extremely venerable and wise. It's no wonder, because rather than running away or giving up like many other doctors did, he went out of his way to help people with a contagious disease, even after losing his wife and 2 children to it. Around 1547, Nostradamus settled in the south of France in Salon de Crau, now known as Salon de Provence, not far from where he was born. He remarried to a widow named Anne Ponsard-Jamel and slowly began to settle down. He was now middle-aged after all, and Salon was beautiful and probably offered some respite from the perils of travel and probably his trauma, with its wide meadows and fruit orchards. The couple had 6 kids, and while raising his children, Nostradamus wrote a number of treatises with advice and methods for good health, most of which definitely don't hold up today, mind you, but most Renaissance medicine doesn't. What made him unique, though, was that he was writing in accessible language for a layman audience rather than other practitioners, and it was also during these years that he began dabblings in what we know him for today: astrological divination. He apparently had constructed an observatory on top of his home where he studied the heavens and began a practice of divinatory consultations. This was quite popular at the time, and he quickly developed a big reputation. For instance, in 1564, a fortuitous visit by King Charles IX and his mother Catherine de' Medici came to Salon. The young king and his powerful mother had been traveling around France for 2 years as riots loomed around the kingdom. According to legend, Catherine was interested in meeting the now 60-years-old Nostradamus, whose reputation had grown significantly by this point. What she wanted was what everyone wanted of him: a glimpse at the future. He reassured her that her sons would be prosperous and would see old age, and that the riots would soon die out. This earned him a position as the counselor and physician ordinary to Charles. Allegedly. Again, lots of stories about him that we aren't quite sure actually happened, but it gives you an idea of his reputation. As Stéphane Gerson writes, the process was indeed labor-intensive. Nostradamus calculated the positions of the ascendant and ephemeres using the tools of the trade, wrote out the horoscopes by hand, and had a secretary transcribe them, and then showed or sent them to his customers. Sometimes he provided several birth charts, each one following a different method. When he was done, Nostradamus summarized his findings in a letter, sealed it in wax, and signed his name along the edge. One could not be too careful. And this is pretty much what we know about Nostradamus, who in later years became known as Nostradamus, a Latin take on his name. He was a soothsayer and doctor who became one of the most famous of his era. He lived a largely peaceful and well-respected life of study, service, and charity. He was known as a stubborn grouch and a charitable man, and he died at a fairly normal age in the place where he grew up and loved. But what happened that made him such a great myth? That would be, of course, the Prophecies. The Prophecies was first published around 1555, and then in its complete edition in 1568 after Nostradamus' death, and contains 10 verses called centuries, composed of 100 quatrains per century, or sets of verse in 4 lines. The quatrains were purposely written to be difficult to decipher and unclear in their actual meaning. Many historians figure that the prophecies are at least partially just paraphrasing pre-existing biblical apocalyptic prophecies, mostly from the Bible, or specifically referencing ominous historical events that had already happened. A big source that Nostradamus used was 1522's Mirabilis Liber, which had been super popular in his youth but had since been largely forgotten, and another source was 1504's De Honesta Disciplina, And by source, I mean he was literally just paraphrasing things from these pre-existing texts. Some scholars even think that he may have been doing the good old-fashioned bibliomancy type thing, where you randomly open a book to a page and close your eyes and point out a section and find meaning that way. So this introduces our first problem with the prophecies. They were Nostradamus' words, sure, but they didn't really come from him. Nostradamus wasn't sitting in his observatory getting struck by divine foresight of disaster. He was interpreting apocalyptic warnings from already published writings, likely with a combination of meditation to assist him. Nostradamus himself even rejected the title of prophet, writing to his son Caesar in the Prophecies preface, "Although, my son, I have used the word prophet, I would not attribute to myself a title of such lofty sublimity." It's actually not too difficult to imagine what drove Nostradamus to become what we call an astrophile. He spent most of his adult life as both a student and physician, caring for people suffering and dying of plague, or hiding from the plague itself. He spent years in close proximity to existential suffering and extremely visible and tangible succumbing to death of people who had done nothing wrong to deserve any sort of cosmic punishment. How do you make sense of life and reality, watching your patients die in the middle of a sentence leaving their lips, their bodies covered in disgusting, painful, oozing pustules? Obviously, Nostradamus began to envision himself destined to be a healer of souls too, because the soul rarely survives being exposed to such horrors, even if the body does. In writing Prophecies, Nostradamus made an attempt to embody the voice of God, specifically a God who would deign to cast a plague upon the earth. In order to heal people's souls, he would need to invoke in them a great fear of future suffering, and that fear could drive them to return to faith and repair their relationship with God. Only then may the horrible prophecies possibly not come to pass. Nostradamus' prophecies were not really a guarantee, they were a warning. As he writes in one quatrain, "To be thus human, his anger will I suffer, and to be cruel, will he be kind to me?" As Denis Crouzet writes, "Is this not how Nostradamus wants to make his reader afraid by conveying to him the measure of this earth-shaking event, so that he will have no part in the worldly failings that will lead to such a chastisement of humanity? Is this not how Nostradamus hopes to heal his reader of the affliction that makes him ignore the fact that everything is transient on this mortal earth, and that violence and misery inevitably follow happiness? Was this not to cure him too of the ailment that attaches him to the wealth and hopes here below, which then incite him to attack, kill, massacre, and tyrannize his fellow creatures?" If you see the curtain moving, that's my cat. She's decided to pay the set a visit. Nostradamus may be our best known historical soothsayer, but he was far from the only one. In fact, the Renaissance was practically crawling with dudes trying to prophesize the future. And many of them also wrote their predictions in verse, claiming divine inspiration rather than a direct line of communication with God. That was the Pope's job, after all. But Nostradamus is the one that has stood the test of time, in part because of the way that his story has been manhandled after his death. When various translators began to bring the prophecies to other languages, the books spread, and the translators themselves sometimes included their own interpretations of the quatrains, or elaborated on his biography in increasingly strange ways. Can you please get out of there? Hey! Stop it. Sorry about that. Not long after Nostradamus' death, a huge commotion broke out in France when people started claiming to see Nostradamus' ghost everywhere. And by the 1990s, we started getting real freaky when some guy publicly claimed to be contacting Nostradamus hypnotically, a prophet to a prophet. I think this was the final straw for people in the academic world, because after a century of some really bonkers shit being published about Nostradamus, making him out to be basically a fairy godmother of the apocalypse, scholars finally started publishing some fact-checking crackdowns. But still, that really couldn't stop what was already in motion. As the new millennium drew nearer, Nostradamus was quickly becoming a mascot and an obsession for the incoming horrors of a modern world. And the vagueness of the prophecies made them the perfect material to be used by scammers and fearful netizens and documentarians alike to explain away our current predicaments and claim that we can foretell the chaos to come. Just don't worry about the fact that they can never give you specifics or tell you when these things will actually happen. They can only be applied to relevant vague events after they've already come to pass, after all. But then, in that case, what's the point? What good is a prophecy that only becomes one in retrospect? The biggest modern fixation on Nostradamus that I can personally remember happened right after 9/11. Now, I was only 5 years old at the time, so I wasn't really privy to the full cultural scope of the catastrophe brewing, but I was old enough to remember it and know it was happening. This was actually my first exposure to the name Nostradamus, and people around me in Texas and people on the internet were certainly suddenly fixated on him all of a sudden. And I didn't know why, nor did I care, because at the time, I was mostly concerned with spending recess pretending to be a sad Victorian orphan who was secretly a fairy. Really important things. Anyway, looking back though, it's not surprising that suddenly Nostradamus entered the public lexicon in such a profound way. Within only a few hours of the World Trade Center falling, email chains started spreading around containing a mysterious prophecy that seemingly foretold a third world war, a burning city, the fall of a great leader, and two brothers torn apart. Now, some of these email bits actually did contain real Nostradamus quatrains, while other pieces, like the thing about two brothers or the new city all a-quake, or other things of that nature, were made up. But amid the chaos, who was fact-checking? Except for Snopes. Nostradamus' prophecies were suddenly a bestseller at every bookstore. People believed fully that this 16th century doctor had actually predicted 9/11, and now he can tell us what to expect in the years to come. In a moment in history so frightening and confusing, why wouldn't people fall for this? The problem is, the prophecies are so vague that they actually could genuinely apply to a large number of events in time if you interpret them this way or that way. They're similar to modern-day astrology in that sense. Every horoscope is just vague enough that most people can think of a way for their life to relate to it. What happens frequently is people see something happen on the news, and they go back and look for something in the prophecies that may apply, and of course there's something in there because the prophecies foretell horrendous doom, and pretty much everything in our news cycle is horrendous doom. And then there's the opposite problem with things like The Simpsons. People continuously spot things shown in The Simpsons, a show which has been on air for decades and has hundreds of episodes, that appear to predict real things happening in the US social and political sphere. The reality is, The Simpsons' whole deal is portraying the most ridiculous scenario possible, and unfortunately, the US increasingly finds itself literally in the most ridiculous scenario possible. Hence why The Onion no longer is able to actually create headlines that are more ridiculous than our reality. These things come to play because the writers correctly have their finger on the pulse of what tends to happen in this country, not because they're prophets. Nostradamus is not really any different. Of course, over the course of 500 years, his prophecies can apply to any large number of events because they vaguely predict likely things that can happen when powerful nations are run by power-hungry, corrupt, greedy ideologues. Nostradamus wasn't predicting specific events because he was, having precognitive visions of the United States. He was correctly warning about the most likely consequences of cruel human nature if left to fester. As Herbert Thurston wrote in his 1915 book, The War and the Prophets, Nostradamus provides an ingenious system of divination in which the misses can never be recorded and only the hits come to the surface. We call this phenomenon retroactive clairvoyance. It certainly doesn't help that most translations of the prophecies are honestly not good, in part because even in the original French, they're really hard to decipher, and some translators took liberties in their translations to make the quatrains fit certain things on purpose. One of the most serious offenders of this is actually fucking Goebbels, the Nazi officer. In order to make it look like the victory of the Third Reich had been a 1,000-year predicted event, he purposely interpreted many of Nostradamus' prophecies to be relevant to the Nazi regime. Not surprising, given that the Nazis were majorly obsessed with the occult, something that they share with their modern-day counterparts on the far right. But given that Nostradamus' prophecies were all forewarnings against apocalyptic crimes of humanity, Isn't it a bit incriminating to see yourself in them? Above all, one thing is certain. The eternal relevance of Nostradamus, a character now so far removed from the original man that he's nearly unrecognizable, is largely a tool of modern culture. Nostradamus has become an unsurprising mascot for a society laden with conspiratorial thinking and fear, mixed with individualism. Stefan Gerson continues, "The internet is the latest mass medium to embrace Nostradamus. This flow of unmediated information exacerbates the crisis of authority by making leading institutions seem ossified and untrustworthy. The medium also brims with hoaxes and conspiracy theories. Nostradamus is tailor-made for a technology and a culture that embraces fragments and discontinuous readings." The greatest appeal of Nostradamus is this promise of guidance from a real historical figure who seemed to have it all figured out, who seemed to have all the answers, and his words can apply to pretty much any situation we encounter. We live in a time that encourages anti-intellectualism and suspicion, a thing that, ironically, the real Nostradamus hated, and instead of putting in the hard work to actually analyze our situation and figure out the answers, we are enticed to satiate our hunger for understanding and knowledge by consuming the nutritionless junk food of answers. Here is a prophecy. Nostradamus knew that this horrible thing would happen, and he knows what will happen in the future. What do we do about it? Nothing, I guess. Stay scared? Stay confused? Isn't it more satisfying to believe in this ephemeral myth instead? As Gerson concludes, the interpretations allow us to confront global perils with sober urgency, while feeding our disillusioned outlook on a world that is so saturated in commentary that everything has been said and nothing truly holds. We don't need prophecies to explain the situation we're in, or what is going to come to pass, no matter how tempting it is. Trying to fixate on the supposed omniscience of a 16th century French doctor isn't going to actually explain our current events. We actually already have all the answers. Only self-reflection and education will do that, which is ironically the very thing that the real Nostradamus advocated for. Religious doomerism aside, at the end of the day, Nostradamus was just a good dude and a talented doctor whose main goal was to try and convince people to be better versions of themselves. And I think rather than the terror of prophecy or foreboding ancient conspiracies, it would do us some good to actually take his advice. Thank you for learning with me about Nostradamus and his strange legacy. I hope you're all taking care of yourselves and finding some joy in the day-to-day, even though things are definitely scary right now. I also want to apologize real quick for my repeated lack of enunciation with Nostradamus' name in this video. I don't know what my deal was for some reason. I just was not pronouncing the S and kept saying Nostradamus. I can already predict the amount of comments I'm gonna get about this. So sorry. If you need a little inspiration from the past for fighting fascism, check out my graphic novel, Liberated: The Radical Art and Life of Claude Cahun. It tells the true story of two queer artists under Nazi occupation on the island of Jersey in World War II, and how they survived and fought back in their own way. It's really inspiring, and I really love drawing it, so definitely pick up a copy. And don't forget to download June's Journey for free by using my link in the description below. And until next time, wash thy hands, wear thy mask, and don't let prophecies scare you.